Hey everyone, welcome to week 2, and I want to start out this intro video by thanking you all for the thoughtful responses and the great videos in the first week. I think you could tell we've plunged right into the thick of the subject matter of our course, so we're not going to kind of save the heavy questions for later. We're going to keep getting right into the thick of it from the beginning. And I just want to maybe highlight what I especially wanted you to get out of the readings that we did last week. I think most of this came through in the responses, but just in case, I want to make a couple highlights. The first is what I think is a concept relatively alien to the mentality that is typical of our time and place and culture, and that is this pervasiveness of God's presence in the whole of the created world, including all of the human. For a variety of reasons, I think that we have developed a kind of imaginary, and this has all kinds of practical ramifications, an imaginary of God's relative absence from the created world, and then we know to name God's presence only in certain interventions that we might call miracles, or say spaces of worship or something of that kind. But what I wanted you to see from the Genesis account, and especially the reading in Thomas Aquinas, which I know is not easy, is that everything that lives, everything that has breath, according to scriptural teaching, is sustained by God's active presence. So that there's no living thing, whether organic or inorganic, in the whole of the created world that is without God's presence flowing through it. And that, I think, is something for us to grow in our knowledge of, because we have inherited a variety of assumptions that enable us to think of the world as sort of autonomous, almost mechanistic, as if living things were all machines. Increasingly, we even use the language of computer technology to describe living things. It's become one of the key sort of sources of metaphorical tropes to make sense of all different parts of the world. And that's just quite alien, frankly, from what we find in the Bible, and that is brought out by Thomas Aquinas. So this pervasiveness of God's presence in the whole of the created world has all kinds of implications for us in terms of what it means to know God and to participate in God's life. That is not something, in fact, that we have a choice in. To be a creature is to be a being participating in God's life. And the question is not whether we're participating in God's life or knowing God's presence. It's how well we're participating in God's life and knowing God's presence. And the Christian faith is a matter of learning that divine presence in all that lives, including ourselves. And it is perhaps a matter of learning how a great deal of that presence is counterintuitive to us, not what we would first think or assume. As much as I appreciate Aquinas' account of this pervasiveness of God's presence, I think it's important to acknowledge that it is still highly abstract, so that the next step we would need to take after affirming this pervasive presence of God is to actually get at the particulars of how God is present in particular creatures and relations of creatures and places made up of creatures. In that sense, there is no presence of God that is identical from one place to another, or from one person to another, or one community to another. There is a particularity to the way that God is pervasively present. And this is partly what invites us to grow in the knowledge of God, in the intricate ways in which God is particularly present in us, to us, in and among our neighbors, the places that are made up of our neighbors and that we share with our neighbors, both human and non-human. So I hope that came through in the reading, and of course the stakes for what this knowledge means for the way that we live are very high, especially according to the readings by Wendell Berry and by Willie Jennings, because our ability to be creatures who love God and love one another depends upon our ability to know God's pervasive presence in and among us and in our places. And to the extent that we allow a sort of estrangement to grow between ourselves and our places, ourselves and our neighbors, between human beings that are strange to us and their places, we begin to see them in a distorted way, to see ourselves in a distorted way, to speak of others and ourselves in distorted ways, and consequently to begin to live destructively in the shape of our bodily life. So the knowledge of God as pervasively present in places and people is crucial to our ability to be creatures who love God and love one another in the particulars and intricacies of our places and our lives. You'll notice in some of my comments in the forums last week that I myself was a little put off by some of the teaching of John Calvin in this regard, as much as there is to appreciate about it. And I think those criticisms are important to engage. Obviously, it's not the final word. I'm happy for people to defend Calvin on some of the points that I was critical, but I just want to remind you that we're reading traditional teachers of the church, not simply as authorities that we accept, but as dialogue partners that we want to engage in a kind of healthy argument with in our own pursuit of the knowledge of God and of one another. As we turn to this week, you have a little bit less reading, you might be glad to know, and I hope that will enable you to perhaps read with a little bit more focus. We're going to be reading a good deal of the book of Exodus and beginning to draw the questions that we began to pose last week into the subject of the wilderness, God's still pervasive presence and self-revelation in the wilderness. And here you're going to see something that I have expressed in the description of this course as thematic for the course, and that is that I am not aiming in this course to give you only some kind of sentimental affection for wilderness spaces. Some of you made some good criticisms already of that approach to wilderness this past week. I am aiming to learn about God's presence in the wilderness so that we might draw on that knowledge for the way that we live in our more urban places. And that is going to mean living critically in those places, engaging the patterns that we have inherited in a critical and constructive way as people who are invested in a future that God has promised, that the tendencies of our industrial culture have moved us against rather than toward. We're going to be reading Wendell Berry again. great essay called The Body and the Earth, but that will come after reading Ellen Davis's essay that is a study in the revelation of God to Israel as Israel leaves Egypt and goes into the wilderness and begins to experience God's provision in the wilderness as a way of being shaped to inhabit the land of promise in a beautiful and healthy and just way. So that hopefully helps you see the direction I'm trying to move us, which is to draw on God's revelation in the wilderness to know better how to pursue a healthy and just life of worship in places of human settlement. Ellen Davis has been a teacher of mine, and so I'm a big fan of her work, not least because it also engages deeply with the text of Scripture, and I think helps us to see what a rich treasure house the Scripture is of really exquisite insight if we can develop the patience to read it carefully. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about these readings that are a little shorter in total this week, but I think just really brimming with insight for us. And I hope you also kind of get a kick out of the first assignment in the first forum for the week, which is going to involve you making a video of yourself in a spot that is meaningful to you in the place that you inhabit. So don't worry about making professional videos or being shy about the videos that you make. The video I put up is certainly not very professional. Mostly we just want to hear your voice, see your face, and in this case, see you in a spot that is meaningful to you according to some of the terms that I've provided in the forum, and to hear the way that you describe that spot. As I say in the forum, we will be sending you back to this spot later in the course after we return from spending some time in the wilderness together and asking you to reflect in that spot on how your experience of it has perhaps been changed by the learning of our course, including the way that you've been formed by a number of days together with God in the wilderness. So God bless you this week, week 2, as you study, and I look forward to interacting with you in the forums.